So when I say non-governmental organization or NGO, I mean not-for-profit. We all know, or we should know, or we should have noticed, that the expansion of not-for-profits and the expansion of the funded voluntary sector in general is the rise of what a friend of mine calls the shadow state. The shadow state. It's a good phrase, huh? That's Jennifer Walsh. The shadow state. Like, think about shadow government. And the shadow state goes hand in hand with the demise of the welfare part of the welfare warfare state, which is to say, the rise of neoliberalism. And remember, neoliberalism is not new nice guys. It's new mean guys. It's the rise of the post-welfare militarist state at home and abroad. So what's happened is this shadow formation, this shadow state, this amazing complex of non-governmental organizations, of NGOs, has risen, right, in the shadow of the state over the last 20 or so years. And to some degree, this shadow state has taken on doing a lot of the work that the state used to do. Educating, taking care of people, social services, you name it, right? Things that used to be part of what the state was supposed to do with our social wage, which is what taxes are, right? That's part of our wages that goes there instead of here. So there are two extremes then in this shadow formation. On the one hand, we can imagine that every state-approved NGO is actually only ever a part of the state that makes war, punishment, and resource extraction and market expansion its central work. And this state, this neoliberal state that we're talking about, so I'm talking about the federal government, I'm talking about the state of California, I'm talking about the government of the county of Santa Barbara, the government of the city of Goleta, I'm talking about the state at all levels. That the state does this work of war and punishment and resource extraction and market expansion under the cover or behind a rhetorical veil of individual responsibility, of executive privilege, and of public-private partnerships, right? So this is where we see it all coming together. But there's another pole, at least. It's not an extreme as in 180 degrees separated from the first one, but there is another pole. And that is this one. Given that there's no such thing as an untainted dollar, and not all NGOs simply do the work of internal pacification that the state isn't doing anymore, then why not just take the money and run? Well, whatever our characteristics, whatever our interests, our purpose, I think, is to build a social movement. That means that we must, of course, build organizations. Because, as Miles Horton and Paulo Freire and a lot of other people have said over the years, a social movement has its basis in organizations. It has its basis in organizations that have some dynamic, grassroots, forward momentum that connects with the forward momentum of other dynamic organizations, and that's where movement comes from, right? So movement doesn't come from somebody laying out the blueprint and everybody playing his or her role, nor does movement come from a kind of random association of organizations at the ground. There's some kind of synergy, there's some kind of genuine forward movement. In the long middle of the 20th century here in the United States, there were all kinds of state-approved, non-governmental organizations that were doing all kinds of work that wasn't necessarily the work of internal pacification. And I said not necessarily, I want to qualify it because we could debate at the end of the day how things turned out. Those organizations include such things as unions, churches, established and not so established, and anti-establishment churches, political parties, and I don't mean the Democrats and the Republicans, but the communist parties, socialist parties, all kinds of political parties around the United States, and other kinds of formations that came together in order to promote some kind of social good, right? So clubs, schools, even media, like publications, publishers and radio. So then, these groups, these formations, these organizations were unified by purpose. These kinds of organizations, unified by purpose, all had paid and or unpaid staff, right? Including unions, I will add. They had a bottom-up resource base, and they had a mission, and the mission is a partial statement of the larger purpose, right? The mission isn't the purpose, and I think that's one of the things a lot of people have forgotten these days. People think that the mission of their organization is the purpose of the movement, rather than the mission of the organization should be a partial statement of the purpose for which the organization came into being in the first place, and the purpose might mean that the organization's usefulness is eclipsed. So I want to give some examples. All right, 1949, Pacifica Radio. They came together, they said, can't we take broadcast out of the market in order to get different sorts of views heard, circulated, debated, and so forth? So they started this network, right, that was based in subscription, and not NPR kind of subscription, real subscription, right? They started a radio station that's never had a single advertisement on it, ever, from 1949 till 2004. So that's one example of ground up. Another example from the long 20th century is the Montgomery bus boycott. The Montgomery bus boycott started December 1st, 1955, when, famously, Rosa Parks didn't move her seat. Wasn't a spontaneous event, and everyone in this room knows that, right? It wasn't spontaneous. She wasn't just saying, oh, I'm tired, right? Although I do not doubt that she was tired. So, how did a group of people concentrated in, but not exclusively organizing in, the city of Montgomery in Alabama, manage to assault and scale apartheid's wall, as they did, right? In the case of that particular action, which had a short-term, a medium-term, and a long-term vision, not only was it not Rosa Parks saying, I'm not going to move tonight, spontaneously deciding to start a movement, but it was people who had been engaged in the long 20th century anti-apartheid movement in the United States who came up with another plan to do the work. So purpose, smash apartheid. Organizations included the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, the Women's Political Council, if that doesn't sound nice and reformist, what does? And the Montgomery Improvement Association. So 3 different kinds of formations, all again with resources derived from the bottom up, right? The Women's Political Council was actually started by a professor, I think, named Joanne Robinson. The Montgomery Improvement Association came into being instantly the bus boycott started in order to coordinate carpools, right? Its mission was to coordinate carpools so people could continue to work in order to achieve the purpose, which was to smash apartheid in the United States, right? So we have an alliance of organizations, right? An overlap of organizations. Organizations like the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church that had no intention of going away, and other organizations that did their work in the short and the medium term toward the end of achieving the long-term purpose. And the third example I have this evening is the UFW, the United Farm Workers. And the United Farm Workers, as you know, came into being first as agricultural workers of California in the late 1950s. And what the agricultural workers of California were doing was trying to revive the most radical agricultural activism the United States had ever known, and that was the activism of the 1930s that shut down harvests in California's Central Valley in 1933, and again almost did it in 1938 in the cotton fields, right? So there's a historical memory there. So AWOC comes into being, UFW emerges out of that in alliance with other organizations and quasi-organizations. And the work then, in the 1960s, for the UFW was not to just go around, of course, and say, we had the glory days in the 1930s, because an entire generation and a half had passed. The Bracero program had cut into the radical organizing of farm workers in this state and around the United States. Farm workers throughout the United States were forbidden by law from organizing, right? And in that context, Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez and others went out and asked people who were making hardly anything at all, maybe a couple of bucks a day, to pay 50 cents a week in dues. Dolores Huerta went to farm worker, and asked for this money and kept being told, no, we can't afford it. And she and Chavez had an infamous debate about this. And Chavez said, the only way we can do this, the only way we can be the organization that will achieve the purpose that we have envisioned for ourselves, to make the movement happen, to organize farm workers here in California and throughout the United States, to organize farm workers regardless of citizenship, organize people who work in the fields, is if they know they own the organization. And when I say own, I mean control. Ownership in which you cannot sell your share. You can only exercise the capacity having a share gives you. So those are 3 examples. Even the Sierra Club. Why is the right gone after the Sierra Club? Why is this an object of struggle? They haven't gone after the Sierra Club to destroy it. They've gone after it to take it over because it's such an effective, again, organization that gets its resource from the base. And I bring up the Sierra Club because there are 2 other points that I'd like to make before I quickly sit down. One is to beware of the politics of purity. I think that many of us, certainly I, am looking for an organizational structure and a resource capability that will somehow be impervious to corruption. I'm looking for something that's so different that somehow the other side won't figure it out. It's impossible. It's absolutely impossible to think up a model that the other side doesn't already or wouldn't already use. And I'll give you an example of that. Imagine this. Imagine neighborhoods in which women come to have a political understanding of themselves and their households in the world. And they go to their neighbors and they say, hey, read this, it changed my life. I'll babysit for you while you read it, and then we can talk about it later while the kids are playing in the yard. Sounds great, huh? And the written works circulate, and people babysit for each other's kids and form these amazingly cooperative organizations which don't have anybody paid at all. And because of what they have learned about themselves in the world and what they perceive to be their purpose in the world, they do things like run for school board, all right? This is the origin of the backbone of the new right, of neoliberalism here in California, right? The suburban warriors who tried to put Goldwater in the White House, who put Ronald Reagan in the governor's mansion, who put Richard Nixon in the White House, and put Ronald Reagan in the White House. So there isn't sort of a pure form that we can find. But this takes us back to thinking again about why not take the money and run, right? And other people are going to talk about how it is that funders make that very difficult, that funders do so much work of doing movement shaping and leadership development, that they make what our work is into something else so that they can continue to pursue an interest that is not the same as our purpose, right? So, what is a foundation? A foundation is stored wealth. A foundation's funds are stolen value created by working people around the world in factories, mines, and fields. That's what foundations are. And most foundation money goes to universities, where it's held in trust for the very thieves who stole it in the first place, right? Right? The children of the elite and so forth. This brings us back one last time to why are we here? I like to think, because I must think, we're not content with tweaking Armageddon. If not, then social movement has to be about acquiring power, which can be made. We have to acquire power, and we can make that, right? Not just fight the power. We have to get the power. See, I'm here. If you want to remember one thing I said tonight, remember this. Power is good. We need it. Okay? That's the take-home message. We want it, we need it, we will have it. And what is it? It is capacity. It is capacity to act with initiative and impunity, with autonomy, which is to say, make revolution or turn things over, right? Power then, in this case, is political. It's not that capacity building that foundations say we'll give you $5,000 for. That's technique. I'm talking about politics. Therefore, not every organization needs to last, right? Not every organization needs to last. Rather, the direction and the momentum of the movement, including collective best practices, including historical memory, that's what must last. That's, in fact, what must come first. Because it's the sum of organizations, not the sustainability of an individual organization, that makes change. Shadow government. And this shadow state goes hand in hand with the demise of the welfare part of the welfare warfare state, which is to say, the rise of neoliberalism. And remember, neoliberalism is not new nice guys. It's new mean guys. It's the rise of the post-welfare militarist state at home and abroad. So what's happened is this shadow formation, this shadow state, this amazing complex of non-governmental organizations, of NGOs, has risen, right, in the shadow of the state over the last 20 or so years. And to some degree, this shadow state has taken on doing a lot of the work that the state used to do. Educating, taking care of people, social services, you name it, right? Things that used to be part of what the state was supposed to do with our social wage, which is what taxes are, right? That's part of our wages that goes there instead of here. So there are two extremes then in this shadow formation. On the one hand, we can imagine that every state-approved NGO, so when I say non-governmental organization or NGO, I mean not-for-profit. We all know, or we should know, or we should have noticed, that the expansion of not-for-profits and the expansion of the funded voluntary sector in general is the rise of what a friend of mine calls the shadow state. The shadow state. It's a good phrase, huh? That's Jennifer Walsh. The shadow state. Like, think about shadow. Is actually only ever a part of the state that makes war, punishment, and resource extraction and market expansion its central work. And this state, this neoliberal state that we're talking about, so I'm talking about the federal government, I'm talking about the state of California, I'm talking about the government of the county of Santa Barbara, the government of the city of Goleta,